Okay, let's have a look at another common mistake that people make, and this mistake is linked with square roots and the h squared from situations such as what we find in Pythagoras' theorem. It also occurs to a certain extent, these mistakes certainly occur when people are tackling the cosine rule as well, at a slightly higher level of mathematics than Pythagoras. And what we find is the following. You might go through a Pythagoras calculation and end up with the final line that h squared equals 16. Now the answer to the question isn't what h squared is. The answer to the question is, what is h? What is the hypotenuse perhaps in a right angle triangle? So what we need to do is we need to work out what the value of h itself is. And a very common mistake that people make is to work out that if h squared equals 16, then h is the answer 8. I think what is quite clear what is going on there is what they've done is they've simply halved the 16 to get the 8 because they're thinking that okay, 8 plus 8 gives you 16, whereas what they're supposed to be thinking is what number multiplied by itself gives you 16, which of course you can work out in your head, and the answer must be 4. So a very common mistake is simply to halve the number that you get there to get this answer here, 4. Now, to be honest, with something like h squared equals 16, because it's such an easy example, far fewer students make this error than for the second example I've written down below. It's because lots of people, lots of students will remember in the exam, I'm looking, h squared is 16, I'm looking for a number, and they do remember, they're looking for a number that times by itself gives 16. And because they know the tables, immediately comes to mind 4 4s are 16. And so they quite often do get the answer right for that one there. They quite often get h equals 4, no problem. Very few students for that one actually put h equals 8, although some do, because they've halved it and not square rooted it. Okay, now the errors really come when we come to a much more awkward number. For example, like h squared equals 35. And if you're trying to work out what the value of h is here, students tend to lose track of the fact that they're looking for a number that is multiplied by itself to give 35. Okay, now because they lose track of this because it's not in their times tables. For example, 6 6s is 36, it's too big, and 5 5s are 25, that's too small. So they lose track of this because it's not in the times tables, and this is what they tend to do. They say, to work out what the h value is, what they'd say is, what number, when you add it to itself, gives 35. And for some reason, when it comes away from the obvious easy one, from the times tables, to a more awkward number, this sort of mistake is far more commonplace. And so we end up with an answer for many students to be 17.5. And obviously what they've done is they've taken the 35 and they've shared it by 2. And 17.5 plus 17.5 is 35. But that is not how you go about finding h from h squared. Remember what you've got to do. You need to press the square root button. The square root button of 35 will give you what number multiplied by itself gives you 35. And that value, if you do it on a square root button, so that was wrong, the actual correct answer should be 5.9 to 1 decimal place. And that's the right answer. So, in other words, 5.9 times 5.9 approximately gives you 35, because there is actually lots of decimals there, I've just approximated it. So remember, when you're doing something like Pythagoras calculation or a cosine rule calculation, and you've got something like h squared equals a number, h squared equals a number, and you want to find what the number itself is, then you simply use the square root button on your calculator. Or for an easy one like that, you can obviously do the square rooting in your head, because you know your tables, you know that 4 4s are 16. Whatever you do, remember to go from h squared to h. You do not share by 2. That's the end of this video on common mistakes.